All right, here we're getting into one that is a pretty obvious precursor, although early, to the American Civil War. We're talking about today the Slave Trade Compromise as well as the Commerce Compromise. The Commerce Compromise does still exist, and it is the basis for a massive amount of federal power today. The Trade Compromise obviously is no longer around. That would have been, pointless after the American Civil War, but it nevertheless is a very important cause, although very early to the American Civil War. And both of these are all about keeping the North and the South balanced. And this compromise, both of them were reached on August 21st, 1787. So the first one is the Slave Trade Compromise, and it says that no new slaves are going to be imported after 1808. It's basically not a full generation, but enough for another generation to be raised and be working at that point. Because the point of the Slave Trade Compromise was, look, I know that the South is very dependent on slaves, right? So we're going to give you a generation. One generation to figure something else out, okay? Because after 1808, no new slaves can be brought from Africa. And the idea was that this would start the process of removing slavery. So in this compromise, in the northern states, they had a desire to keep the Union intact, just like the South did, but the North saw a split coming, and the South was much more willing to split over the issue of slavery. They agreed to wait until 1808 before Congress would be able to ban the slave trade in the United States. And just so you know, in March of 1807, the eventual President Thomas Jefferson did sign a bill abolishing the slave trade, and it took effect on January 1st, 1808. So this does eventually happen. Although part of this compromise was the Fugitive Slave Law, which required northern slaves to deport any runaway slaves, which ends up being a win for the South. The South basically says, oh, we lose the ability to get new slaves from Africa, but any slaves that run away have to be sent back. So once you have a certain amount of slaves, they'll have families, and more slaves will be created that way. As long as you don't lose any slaves, that's been taken care of. This ends up being, in total, a win for the South. The recorded comments of August 22nd are pretty enlightening and explanatory, and even a bit surprising. Roger Sherman of Connecticut, an opponent of slavery from a free state, proposed the language be adopted as is, suggesting that slavery was on the decline in some southern states and would continue towards its natural death if left alone to do so. George Mason, himself a slave owner from the southern state of Virginia, he conversely, argued that it was essential for the national government to have the power to prevent the increase and spread of slavery. He observed that every master of slaves is a petty tyrant, bringing the judgment of heaven on a country. George Mason, Thomas Jefferson, men like them that owned slaves but were very anti-slave, felt that the only way they could make money to be able to do what they wanted to do was to continue doing what they were already doing. They didn't have an answer. They just knew they didn't like slavery. They didn't like it at all, but they didn't have an answer. Yes. So, okay. The Commerce Compromise. This was about protecting Southern trade. At the time of the Constitutional Convention, the North was industrialized, means they had factories, and produced many finished goods. The South still had an agricultural economy and still imported many finished goods from Britain. Northern states wanted the government to be able to impose import tariffs on finished goods to protect against foreign competition and encourage the South to buy goods made in the North, and also export tariffs, taxes on anything being sent away, to other countries on raw goods, which would increase revenue flowing into the United States, where there's industry, aka the North. However, the southern states feared that export tariffs, taxes on goods sent somewhere else, which that's what they did. They produced raw goods, tobacco, indigo, cotton. They produced raw goods and sent them to other countries. At this time, Great Britain made more clothes out of cotton than anyone else. And they bought it from the South. So the South's money came from selling to other places. You create export tariffs, you're taking money from the South and giving it to the North. So they said that this would hurt their trade upon which they heavily relied. The compromise mandated, made it, you have to do it, that tariffs were only to be allowed on imports from foreign countries and not exports from the United States. This compromise also dictated that interstate commerce would be regulated by the federal government. That's the part that still exists today. Why does the government today get to say, well, we get control over anything we want? Well, a lot of it has to do, we'll say, you know, that truck taking stuff from a plant in one country or one state to another state, it crossed state lines. Therefore, we have control over what happens because of this compromise, this commerce clause. It also required that all commerce legislation must be passed by a 2/3 majority in the Senate, which in total equals a win for the South because it countered the power of the more populous northern states, meaning that the northern states, there were more of them, and in the Senate, everybody got equal representation. By making it a 2/3, anything to do with commerce, that meant that the North would have to have some of the southern states' support to be able to create those laws. Now, how were these two laws tied together? Well, these two compromises were tied together by the desire of the southern states to protect their interests. Both of these were because the South were nervous about losing money, losing power, losing influence. So both of these were born from that. In both instances, the South was trying to protect their way of life, which was financed, paid for, by producing agricultural products through slave labor. If you look at the diagram above me, it says slave trade and commerce trade. It's a breakdown of them. The first one, where it's underlined at the top, says free states, northern states. These wanted to abolish the slave trade, and they were worried that Congress would regulate foreign and interstate trade. The second part, where it's underlined, says slave states. This would be the southern states. They wanted to continue importing slaves. They argued that it has benefited the economies of both the South and the North. And they did not want higher taxes if Congress regulated trade. And they did not want exports to be taxed. The compromise, the slave trade compromise, the commerce compromise, what did they do at the bottom, the third part? This says slave trade continues for 20 years when Congress would eventually decide on the issue. And we read that in 1808, Thomas Jefferson does pass a bill that does end the slave trade. No new slaves from Africa. Each imported slave would be taxed $10. And Congress could regulate trade, foreign and interstate, but it could not tax exports. Hopefully this has been helpful.